Okay, so we continue with the biblical theology. Like I said, sorry if I'm here, but just if you could look at the screen. Thanks to Ivy, she's not here. She was able to correct me. Last time we met, I said that we were going to do Abraham, but I actually meant to say we were going to do Noah. And it's kind of timely because the movie came out, and maybe this can give you a bit of a more biblical perspective. Always remember when we're coming here, we're trying to learn biblical theology, and biblical theology is the redemption story. So we're not necessarily going to dive into too much detail on the story that we're looking at, like for example, who is Noah and such and such. We're really looking at how does this play into the redemption story? How does this make sense in God's story? But of course, you cannot take away Noah from the story if it is about Noah. So today we're going to be looking at the flood. So we started with, from last week, the summary for last lesson. You know, we had the 5 covenantal parts before Exodus. Last time I had 4 because I forgot the flood. The creation, the fall. We talked about the creation, the fall already. The flood, and Abraham and the patriarchs. And so, like I said, we talked about the fall. Just to get a little summary, what was the fall? What did we learn about the fall? We learned that sin is an intruder to God's story. That was so important. Remember, the Israelites are introduced to creation. It's a beautiful thing, a wonderful thing, yet sin is introduced. Sin is man's flight, rebellion from God. We learned that, hey, where's sin presented in the Genesis account? It's actually the action of, it's not the serpent, even though Satan, a lot of times we think of sin with Satan or Satan with sin. If we're going to be technical, it is sin is man's flight, disobedient, rebellion from God. We also learned that sin has consequences to all creation. I believe it was Romel who read it, I'm not sure, but Romans 8:22 talks about that. It's not just men who, when I say men, I mean human beings. It wasn't just us who paid the penalty. As mediators, Adam unfortunately brings a curse upon the whole world. And we learned that in the second coming of Christ, we're not the only ones waiting, so is the whole creation. And you know, creation is an inanimate object. You know, there's the earth, the rocks, but there's also the animals, the birds. But it says that all creation is groaning. And we can't take that too literal, like it's actually making noise. But we have to say that there's a pain being observed by the whole creation. And the third point is that God is the one to initiate His redemption story. And even in Genesis 3:15, we see the first act of redemption, where now we see a pattern of the seed of woman versus the seed of the serpent. And where does Christ come in that? I hope you know. Which seed is Christ from? Of the woman. And now, of course, we find out to be, and that woman, you have to understand, is not necessarily speaking of, don't think of Mary because Jesus was born from a virgin. That's not what it's trying to say. It was trying to point out that it's between the seed, and which will come out from Judah, and you'll see the lineage, and against the rebellious side, the seed of the serpent. So that was the summary for last lesson. Today's lesson, so we had the creation, the fall. Now we have the flood. So we learned 2 important themes, or we could say that there's 2 themes that are made alive in the flood account in regards to the redemption story. And unfortunately, whenever somebody thinks of the Noah story, and it's not just PCC, you can go to any Christian or group, and the first 2 things that come with that people spend time on this Noah story, I guess it's 3 now, but 2 is, one is that, hey, let's make it into a children's story. Always, if you go to any Sunday school for kids, you're gonna have to include the Noah story because it's got the little cute animals, it's got the nice boat. Let's make it into a kid's story. So that's the attention it gets. Or you get the people like the creationist people who want to prove that the world was covered with water. And I'm not saying that it doesn't have a place in the kids section nor in the creation section, but that's not what the Noah story is about. And I guess we can include a movie. People would like to make movies out of the Noah story. So it has appeal to it. People are drawn into it. Hey, let's make a storybook. Hey, let's make a movie. Or hey, let's debate about whether the world really, and they try to spend all time to try to prove that the world is covered, this and that. There's a time and place for all of those things, but we have to understand that that's not why it's included. When the Israelites received this, God wasn't trying to prove to them that, hey, I got a little story for you children so that I'm good bored in the wilderness. Or, hey, here's a little, here's a story so that you can understand how the world was created and it's not really about evolution. No. God, when He included this, when He spoke to Moses, it was all about two things. And the first one is God's covenantal judgment. I hope by now I made it clear what covenant is and that we to God have a relationship by covenant. And so when I use the term covenant, I hope that now it's clicking. Oh man, we're under covenant. I talked about the blessings, the cursing, always coming to mind. And I'll keep reminding you, but I want you to realize, because once we arrive to the New Testament, things are going to start clicking. And you're like, whoa. And it's going to blow your mind at how awesome redemption is. But you need to start picking these things up. I know we only meet twice a month, but remember this language I'm using, that it is covenantal. So the first one is God's judgment. And what do I mean by that? Well, what do we see in the Noah story? Well, from the fall to the flood. What's in between? Well, we see Cain kills Abel, Genesis 4:7. Everybody knows this right from the get-go, right? Adam and Eve had children. And we don't really know who else is there. It just tells us that there was two brothers and they brought sacrifices to God, and God for some reason did not accept Cain's, and Abel's He did, and Cain took upon sin, or allowed sin to crouch at its door. He opened the door for it and ends up killing his brother. And right away we see death being implemented, a sort of evilness. Remember last time I told you that it is a high possibility that death existed already, but now we see it in the negative sense, in the murderous. Remember, when the Bible says in the Ten Commandments, it does not say, thou shalt not kill, even though a lot of times we think it says kill. It actually says thou shalt not murder, because there's a difference, the two. And so now we start seeing evil intention. Then we also see Lamech. Anybody remember Lamech? I was always confused of what Lamech was trying to say. It's right at the beginning. He's saying, I think he says something along the lines. If somebody could read it, actually, Genesis 4:23-24.
I know the context is that those who have tried to kill Cain, and try to kill me, may that consequence be more.
Can somebody read it? But you're in the ballpark. Genesis 4:23-24.
Genesis 4:23 and 24 says, Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times.
So I never understood that until I read more into it and more in context of it. And what actually that is he's boasting. Now we're seeing pride being implemented. Lamech is saying Cain was avenged 7 times. Guess what? Me 77 times. I'm killing and I'm avenged. I'm doing right. So in his eyes, killing was a good thing, and he's boasting. That is actually, if you read the Bible, I mean, Ramel just read it, but you may not see it, but if you open up to that, you'll notice that the stanzas are more put like in a poetic way, is because he's actually, a lot of times people back in the day, biblical times, they use a lot of poetry, and he was sort of singing a song, sort of like boasting, and it's the first poetic genre, the first poetic lines that we get from the Bible, and it's not a pretty one. It's a boasting one. It's one boasting about killing. And then we in Genesis 6:5 we identify that men are wicked. God is actually, and the language is a little interesting, where God says He regrets making mankind. And now, those are stinging words, you know. We could stand in here and debate about what exactly does it mean regret. Does God regret making things? We also have to understand that a lot of these things is written for us to sort of grasp. But we don't have to waste time in trying to think about things like that. But we should spend more time about realizing that God is not pleased with His creation. And it's sad because we're talking about chapter 6 from just 5 chapters away from everything was good. Everything was good. And man, did everything go down south the moment the God created something? No, they're just trying to make the emphasis that this is creation, the fall came in, and now there is a huge difference from what was good and no more good. So the historical flood account reveals two things. So we're still looking at the covenantal judgment. So the fact that this actually happened. Why is it important that we know that this happened? Remember, if you watch, I actually haven't seen the Noah movie, but a lot of times people, one of the first places that people find fault in the Bible that like to prove that there's fault is the Noah. They say, oh, do you think the world was really covered in the water, this and that? But there's a point, like I was saying, that's not the point why God mentioned it. He wasn't saying, hey, so then you're going to have a chance to prove it. No, there's a reason why it's important to realize that there's a historical actually happened, that this is not a myth account. The first one is that the geographical power that sin has. It really reveals that, hey, even though where does sin start? In a little place called Eden, the Garden of Eden. Yet now we see this spread, and it's huge. We see the spread that the flood had to cover the world because not so that we can prove that disprove or prove something, just to know that, hey, sin is vast, that God had to take things to the extreme. It's very important to realize, man, like, things are chaotic once the fall started. So the first thing you should, when you're reading the Noah story, you should, man, this is not good times, that God had to bring a flood. And the second one is for a future reference, the real physical judgment that follows ungodliness. If someone could read 2 Peter 3:7, 2 Peter 3:7, maybe Mela? 2 Peter 3:7.
Above all, you must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, where is this coming? He promised. Ever since our ancestors died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation. But they deliberately forget that long ago, by God's word, the heavens came into being and the earth was formed out of water and by water. By these waters, also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. By the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly.
Okay. Those are long, so I would like somebody else to read it again, because I think whenever you hear a long passage twice, it really sticks to you. Allison?
2 Peter 3:3-7. Above all, you must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, where is this coming? He promised. Ever since our ancestors died, everything goes on as it has the beginning of creation. But they deliberately forget that long ago, by God's word, the heavens came into being, and the earth was formed out of water and by water. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. By the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly.
Great. Thank you, Mela. Thank you, Allison. So hopefully reading it twice we caught up some words, but I'll explain it. So Peter here is writing a letter And he's saying in the last days, and sometimes when we look at the word last days, we think to come. But actually the last days is when Christ ascends. That's the beginning of the last days. And so the last days is happening now. And he's saying there's going to be people who are going to scoff. They're going to say, and I think Pastor Tim really made a good point where today we're saying that there's going to be a lot of people say, look, I have a pretty good life. I don't see God doing anything. But he was saying, do you realize, and it's awesome how Peter doesn't right away say, do you remember Noah? Do you remember what happened? First he says, do you remember creation? How did creation take about? The same word that was spoken. Guess what? The same word that spoke is the same word that brought the flood. And this is the same word that's going to come and bring the second coming, the judgment. So you have to realize for us, we're very removed from the Old Testament. That's what's important to study it. We're removed culturally, we're removed by time, we're removed by social understanding and many other things. So for us, when somebody says, if I say, the second coming is not going to be pretty if you're not a Christian, and somebody says, really, I don't care, how bad can it be? And if I say, well, do you know the flood, Noah? For us, maybe we're not going to be able to grasp it. But for them, this was a Jewish or Old Testament people understanding it, that they're able to realize he's pointing to this was actual an event, and it happened, and people died, and it's going to happen again. To the same word that spoke, it's going to happen. Just because it's not happening now doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And so it also points to a real physical judgment for ungodliness. It's important to realize this, because what did I say about a covenant? A covenant has blessings, but it also has curses. And it's important to realize that this is not going to be, hey, some people get to have a pretty relationship with God, and that's great, but the rest kind of miss out. No, the rest face judgment, and it's a physical reality. And the first time was with water, the second time is with fire, and that's intense. But that's one importance. If someone says, what's the importance of understanding the flood? Is the first one is the judgment, and the judgment brings to, and if somebody says, yeah, but it's a good story, and I believe that this story is in the Bible because it gives a view that God does punish, but it doesn't mean it has to be real, then I would disagree. I said no, because it's important to see that this was a real overall account of how bad sin was and how God dealt with it. And it's also important to realize that, hey, the second one coming is going to be just as bad and even more, because that was not yet finished. And so it's important to realize that it is a reality. And now we come to the second part. So I said the first one is God's covenantal judgment, but the other one is God's grace. And we do see it in the flood account. And in fact, it's very important to realize why. Because in the flood account, we see God's redemption continued. It continues. Don't think of God's redemption as separate covenants. Like, here's a promise here, here's a promise there. When you split God's promises, it gives you a weak God. It makes you think, what is God able to do? What did God say? It makes understanding God's will very difficult, because you're compartmentalizing different promises, where the promise is the same. Is I am gonna redeem my people. I am gonna redeem my creation. And so it shows you that, hey, this is continuing. It's not over. Like, I mean, heck, as soon as you guys messed up, my grace is already following. And so we see this in the redemption pattern, and we're gonna keep seeing this. And this is a good thing to realize, is that God provides, divinely provides, the creation. What happens? Men disobey. God brings judgment. Judgment has to come when it comes to a covenant. It's inevitable. It's what the covenant is about. But yet God's grace is so great that even though blessings are only there if we obey, the blessing still comes, and they come in the form of grace. God, when we think of Noah, we think, oh, Noah was a great guy. Thank God he was great, because else men would have been done for. No, you can't think that way. You have to say, thank God for God's promise from the beginning, because God used Noah for him to carry out the seed of the woman. Always think of God's promise from the get-go, from the beginning. It wasn't like there was a great chance, an awesome small chance that there would happen to be one person following God. Don't make it about Noah. Always make it about God. It was God who called Noah. It wasn't Noah who called God. And so that's very important. It's a story about God. And so we see His grace. And three things we realize about God's grace in the flood account. The first one is that God's grace is tied to His promise to redeem His creation. It's important to realize that God is not just randomly throwing out grace because He's a loving God. Of course, we can say that, oh, God is love, God is a loving God, God is a gracious God, that He lavishes grace. You could use that terminology, you could say it, but you have to realize that there is a reason why grace is following, is because of His promise. So we don't take promises seriously anymore. You know, especially when we say, oh, I promise you I'll be there. Or we may say, you know, the word swear, you know, like I swear, it is, you know, but there's no weight behind it. But God's promises have super weight behind it. And grace has to abound. And you may think God doesn't have to do anything. Well, He has to do with who He is. And His grace abounds because His promise is real. You have to realize that God works, God is a God of order. And sometimes we like to think of God's grace as sort of like, why can He be unfair? Like, why shouldn't He judge and just let it be judged? We don't realize that God is also working in a special framework of promises, of covenant. And I'm trying to drag that in because it'll make the story of Jesus so much more powerful, because it's going to make you say, why did He have to die on the cross? Why did He have to do this? Why did He have to, you know, these are all beautiful acts of love, but at the end of the day, He didn't have to do those things. Yet Christ was very adamant about, or very serious, very on point about, no, Scripture's got to be fulfilled. Scripture's got to be fulfilled. Yeah, why? Why did He have to do it? Was He just like a goody two-shoes that He had to make sure everything Daddy's ways followed? No, there was a whole covenant thing bounding. And as we move to Abraham, you're going to see how awesome this covenant really is. And it's unfolding, not added to it, it's really unfolding. Second is that judgment can only kill. Grace must be there to bring life. This is awesome to realize, because judgment is only there to help out, to bring out grace. And the book of Romans really mentions that, how the law, and remember, Apostle Paul makes it clear, the law kills, but it's grace, the grace of God, that brings life. And it makes you realize that judgment is not the bad guy, but the job of judgment is to kill. Judgment is not the bad guy, but its job is to kill. Grace is the job to give life. And so, it's the same with the law. So I know sometimes it blows your head, like, what is the law to us? The law is beautiful, but its job is to condemn us. The job of grace is also beautiful, and is to give us life. And so we can't separate the two. God is both a God of judgment, but a God of grace. And we can't separate the two. And you can only appreciate grace if you understand that He is also a God of judgment. And then the last one is God's grace to redeem His whole creation back to Him, including animals. And that's hard to grasp. I mean, we talked about how how the whole creation was screwed up because of Adam. God promises that His creation, all of it, is going to be redeemed. And the flood gives us a little bit of that vision. How do we know that? Because He doesn't just save Noah, He saves His animals, right? A lot of times, once again, I'm not trying to bash the creation people, because I also believe in that, and I read a lot about it, and I respect their work. But it's not about, wait a minute, how many animals did they have? How big was the ark? what kind of animals were in the ark, you know, forget that. You have to realize that the whole point of the Noah story, God wasn't trying to, nobody was going to ask, wait a minute, you know, what about dogs? Were they in there? How did you keep them from going crazy? It's not about that. It's realizing, wait a minute, God, in His judgment, brought grace, but brought grace throughout the whole, throughout His whole creation. And remember, it wasn't a completion. Animals died. Things were broken, but it showed you a little bit of what's to come. Remember, everything we're going to learn is going to show us what's to come, future events. And in all, at the end of the days, when Christ comes back, there's going to be purging, there's going to be fire. We don't really know. The Bible talks about how fire is going to take place, how things are going to happen. But at the end, there's going to be a restoration of all things, including animals. You know, so some people say, like, can dogs go to heaven? Can animals, can cats go to heaven? Honestly, there's going to be animals when we go, not to heaven, because remember, I hope you realize by now that heaven is not a resting place. Paradiso is not our resting place. Paradise is not. Our resting place is earth, but not this earth. The Bible talks about the new creation. And that's really when we say heaven. That's really what we're talking about. Are they going to be animals? Yeah. They were there at the beginning. Why they shouldn't be there now? Whether it is the same dog that died and went up there, I can't tell you. Right? The Bible doesn't tell you. If somebody's bawling and crying and he says, is my dog going to be in heaven? I say, hey, maybe. I sure hope so. But we don't know. But we do know animals are going to be there. We do know that creation is going to be there. We do know we're not going to be angelic beings just floating and playing the harp. You know, it's going to be life more than we can imagine. And so that's the story about the flood, the Noah story. So next time you hear about it, if you watch the movie, if you want to enjoy it, you know, just be smart about it, but don't make it about Noah. The movie critics or the movie producers saw an opportunity to make money and they took it. Children's stories, they take an opportunity. Some people take an opportunity for a lot of things, but at the end of the day, as Christians, we should realize that this is about God's judgment, but also God's grace. And I'm done with this, but I do want to tell you a fun fact which I never knew. The word rainbow, it's actually translated, it's actually only supposed to be bow. And it's actually an arch bow. I never heard, maybe some of you who grew up in the church heard that, but it's actually a bow meant for archery, like meaning for war. And so some people believe that the reason that this is called the bow is because this is the first time that God, all other places God talks about how He's pointing at His enemies who went against them. But this is the first time that talks about it's sort of putting it down and the bow is pointing up to God, where God is taking the sort of like the punishment. It's a beautiful picture. I wouldn't go too far with it. You know, I wouldn't make a whole theology behind it. But it's something cool to realize, you know, the bow, and it should really be translated, here is my, you'll see in the sky, is a bow. That's the name of it. It's not a rainbow. They added the word rain because it was rain and also springs that brought in the water. But it's actually the word bow. And some translation will only put the word bow. And it's an archery bow. It's a weapon of killing, of destruction. Yet we see it put away. Yet that is the representation. And when you go to Revelation, in the throne where God is standing, there is a rainbow by His feet. And it's kind of cool telling you that, and we think of the rainbow as it being for us, but it's actually for God. God said, I will put a rainbow to remember that I will not do this again. We are derivatives where we can also remember when we look at the rainbow of God's promises, but it's really for God. It allows God to continue in His process of redemption and see, this is the steps I'm taking. And you know, the cross, Jesus, all these things are pointers that eventually brings us to salvation, to the cross, and then eventually to the new creation. So it's all beautiful, and it's sad when we miss it because we make kid stories, we make it all about the characters. You know, let's do a Bible study on characters. There's a time and place for that, but our goal is to study God in